Sarah never imagined that her peaceful life in the Boston suburbs would turn into a real nightmare. She had moved to this quiet neighborhood with her husband Mike and 5-year-old daughter Emily, hoping to find safety and tranquility. Their new house seemed perfect, spacious, with a large yard and friendly neighbors. At least, that's how it was at first. Everything changed when the Thompson family moved into the neighboring house, a middle-aged couple and their adult son Jason. At first glance, they seemed like an ordinary family, but Sarah quickly noticed that something wasn't right about them. Mrs. Thompson, a thin woman with a nervous gaze, often stood by the window, looking at Sarah's house. Sometimes Sarah would wake up in the middle of the night and see her silhouette in the window across the street. It was eerie, but Sarah tried to convince herself it was just a coincidence. Mr. Thompson rarely left the house, but when he did, he always carried large garbage bags to the garage. One day, Sarah noticed dark stains on one of the bags that resembled blood. She tried to convince herself that it was probably just meat juice, but suspicions nagged at her. Jason worried Sarah the most. A tall and strong man in his 30s, he often sat on the porch, closely watching Emily as she played in the yard. His gaze was so intense that Sarah began to limit her daughter's time outside. One evening, when Mike was away on a business trip, Sarah heard strange sounds coming from the Thompsons' house. There were muffled screams and the sounds of blows. She was about to call the police when everything suddenly went quiet. The next day, she saw Mr. Thompson painting the garage wall, even though it already looked freshly painted. Sarah's suspicions grew with each passing day. She began to document every strange incident related to the Thompsons. She photographed Mr. Thompson with the garbage bags and recorded the dates and times of Mrs. Thompson's nightly observations. One day, Sarah noticed that an elderly woman who lived on their street had disappeared. No one had seen her for several days. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow connected to the Thompsons. The situation escalated when Sarah caught Jason talking to Emily through the fence. He was holding a bright toy and trying to convince the girl to come closer. Sarah ran out of the house, grabbed her daughter, and pulled her inside. Jason just smiled and waved as if nothing had happened. That same night, Sarah woke up to the sound of breaking glass. She froze, listening to footsteps in the house. Someone was inside. With trembling hands, she dialed 911. But before she could speak, the bedroom door opened. Mrs. Thompson stood in the doorway with a crazed smile on her face. "We know that you know," she whispered before lunging at Sarah. A struggle ensued, during which Sarah managed to scream for help into the phone. Suddenly, Mr. Thompson appeared in the room. He grabbed his wife and dragged her away, muttering something about her ruining everything. Sarah heard them quickly leaving the house. The police arrived within minutes. They searched the Thompsons' house and found horrifying evidence. In the basement, they discovered a room with walls covered in photographs of Sarah and other neighbors. They also found personal belongings of the missing elderly woman. But the most terrifying discovery waited in the garage. Under the freshly painted wall, the police found walled-up human remains. Forensics identified them as the bodies of several missing people from neighboring areas. The Thompsons were declared wanted. It turned out they were serial killers who moved from city to city, leaving a trail of corpses behind them. Jason wasn't their son, but an accomplice who helped lure victims. Sarah and her family were in shock. Their sense of security was completely shattered. They couldn't believe they had been living next to such monsters. Even after the Thompsons were caught and convicted, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of anxiety. They decided to sell the house and move, but nightmares haunted them for a long time. Sarah often woke up in the middle of the night, thinking she saw Mrs. Thompson's face in the window. Emily was afraid to play outside, constantly looking around to see if someone was watching her. Years passed before they could regain a sense of security. But even then, Sarah always carefully scrutinized new neighbors, looking for signs of anything suspicious. She knew that sometimes the greatest danger could hide behind a friendly neighbor's smile. This story reminds us that we can never be entirely sure about who lives next to us. Behind closed doors, terrible secrets can hide, and people we consider ordinary neighbors may turn out to be dangerous criminals. The incident with the Thompsons changed not only the lives of Sarah and her family, but the entire neighborhood. People became more vigilant and less trusting of strangers. Neighborhood get-togethers, once so popular, now rarely happened, and when they did, it was in an atmosphere of tension and suspicion. The police increased patrols in the area, but it did little to help. Every rustle at night, every unfamiliar car on the street caused alarm among the residents. Many families installed security systems and surveillance cameras, turning the once friendly suburb into a fortress-like camp. Sarah often thought about how she could have been so blind. She recalled every interaction with the Thompsons, looking for signs she might have missed. Was there a special gleam in Mrs. Thompson's eyes when she stood by the window? Were Mr. Thompson's movements too measured when he carried those suspicious bags? And how could she not have noticed Jason's predatory gaze when he looked at Emily? These thoughts haunted her, turning each day into a struggle with her own fears and doubts. She became an overprotective mother, rarely letting Emily out of her sight. Her marriage to Mike was also in jeopardy, as her paranoia and constant anxiety created tension in their relationship. Only after years of numerous therapy sessions was Sarah able to start rebuilding her life. She realized that she couldn't control everything and everyone around her, but she could learn to trust her intuition and be vigilant without letting fear rule her life. The story of Sarah and the Thompsons became a local legend, whispered to new residents of the neighborhood. It served as a reminder that evil can hide anywhere, even in the most unexpected places. But it also reminded people of the power of community and the importance of being attentive to one's neighbors, not with suspicion, but with care and understanding. Over time, the neighborhood began to recover. People started communicating again, organizing community events, trying to restore the sense of community that had been lost. But the shadow of the past still remained, reminding everyone that dark secrets could hide behind friendly smiles and well-kept lawns. For Sarah, this story became a turning point in her life. She learned to cherish every moment with her family, understanding how fragile security can be. She also understood the importance of trust and openness in relationships with people, while not forgetting to be cautious. The incident with the Thompsons forever changed the lives of Sarah and her neighbors, reminding them that sometimes the scariest monsters don't live under the bed or in the closet, but behind the wall of the neighboring house. Olivia Green, a 34-year-old freelance graphic designer, had always dreamed of living in a quaint, historic home. When she stumbled upon a listing for an affordable duplex in a small town in upstate New York, she jumped at the opportunity. The house, a Victorian-era beauty with intricate woodwork and stained glass windows, seemed perfect. The fact that the other half of the duplex was vacant didn't bother Olivia. She relished the idea of having extra peace and quiet for her work. Moving in during the crisp days of early October, Olivia quickly settled into a routine. Her home office, set up in a cozy nook overlooking the overgrown backyard, became her sanctuary. She spent long hours at her computer, designing logos and websites for clients across the country, often working late into the night. As the days grew shorter and the nights longer, Olivia found herself increasingly aware of the empty space on the other side of her walls. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, she thought she heard faint noises, the creak of a floorboard, the soft thud of a closing door. But she dismissed these sounds as the natural settling of an old house or her imagination working overtime. One particularly stormy night in late October, Olivia was up against a tight deadline. Rain lashed against the windows, and wind howled through the eaves of the old house. She had been working for hours, her eyes strained from staring at the computer screen. Around midnight, she decided to take a break and make some tea. As she waited for the kettle to boil, a flash of lightning illuminated the backyard. For a split second, Olivia thought she saw a figure standing among the overgrown shrubs, staring directly at her kitchen window. Her heart raced as she peered into the darkness, But she saw nothing but rain and swaying branches. Shaken, Olivia returned to her work, trying to convince herself that it had been a trick of the light. But as she sat at her computer, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every few minutes, her eyes darted to the windows, searching the darkness beyond. Around 2 a.m., just as Olivia was putting the finishing touches on her project, the power flickered and went out. The sudden darkness was absolute, broken only by intermittent flashes of lightning. Olivia fumbled for her phone, using its flashlight to navigate through the house in search of candles. As she lit the candles in her living room, a loud thud echoed from the other side of the house, the vacant half of the duplex. Olivia froze, her breath catching in her throat. It sounded as if something heavy had fallen, or as if someone had knocked over a piece of furniture. For several long moments, Olivia stood perfectly still, straining to hear any further sounds. The storm outside seemed to grow quieter, as if it too was listening. Then, unmistakably, she heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the floor of the vacant unit. Panic gripped Olivia. She knew she should call the police, but her phone was in the other room, and she was afraid to move. The footsteps continued, growing louder as they approached the wall separating the two halves of the house. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the wall, as if someone had slammed their fist against it. Olivia let out a strangled cry, stumbling backward. The banging continued, moving along the wall towards the door that connected the two units. Olivia had never opened that door, assuming it was locked from both sides. Now, to her horror, she heard the sound of a key turning in the lock. The door began to open slowly, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. In that moment, survival instinct took over. Olivia ran for the front door, her hands shaking so badly she could barely turn the deadbolt. Just as she heard footsteps entering her side of the house, she wrenched the door open and ran out into the storm. Rain soaked her instantly as she sprinted down the street, barefoot and in her pajamas. She could hear heavy footsteps behind her, splashing through puddles. Olivia ran without direction, her only thought to get as far away from the house as possible. As she rounded a corner, she saw the welcoming glow of lights from a 24-hour diner. Sobbing with relief, Olivia burst through the doors, collapsing onto the floor. The startled staff rushed to her aid, wrapping her in blankets and calling the police. When the officers arrived, Olivia recounted her terrifying experience through chattering teeth. A patrol was immediately dispatched to her house, while an ambulance was called to check on Olivia's condition. The police found no sign of an intruder in either half of the duplex. The connecting door was locked and showed no signs of being forced. There were no wet footprints, no evidence of anyone having been in the vacant unit. The officers suggested that the stress of working late, combined with the violent storm, might have caused Olivia to imagine the whole incident. But Olivia knew what she had heard and seen. She refused to return to the house that night, instead checking into a nearby hotel. The next day, still shaken, she began looking for a new place to live. As she was packing up her belongings, assisted by a friend, Olivia made a chilling discovery. Hidden behind a loose baseboard in her home office, she found a small notebook. The pages were filled with detailed observations of her daily routine, her work schedule, even what she ate for dinner each night. The final entry, dated the night of the storm, read simply, "Tonight." The police took the notebook as evidence, but no fingerprints were found, and the handwriting didn't match any in their database. The previous tenants of both units were questioned, but none had any useful information. The case eventually went cold, filed away as an unsolved mystery. Olivia moved to a busy apartment complex in the city, where the constant presence of neighbors made her feel safer. But she never fully recovered from her experience in the duplex. She installed extra locks on her doors and windows, and always slept with the lights on. Months later, Olivia received an unmarked envelope in the mail. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph showing her asleep in her new apartment. On the back, written in the same handwriting as the notebook, were the words, "I'm still watching." The incident at the duplex became something of a local legend in the small town. Curious teenagers would dare each other to spend the night in the now abandoned house, though no one ever managed to stay until dawn. Those who tried reported hearing footsteps in the empty rooms and feeling an overwhelming sense of being watched. Years passed, and the duplex fell into disrepair. Eventually, the town council decided to demolish it to make way for a new development. As the wrecking crew began their work, they made a gruesome discovery. In the walls separating the two units, they found a network of narrow passages and hidden chambers. And in one of these chambers, they found human remains. Forensic analysis revealed that the bones belonged to multiple individuals, some dating back decades. Among the remains, investigators found scraps of paper, journal entries describing the habits and routines of past occupants of the duplex. The case attracted national attention, with true crime enthusiasts and paranormal investigators flocking to the town. Theories abounded about the identity of the killer. Was it a long-dead former owner of the house, or something more supernatural? For Olivia, the news brought a mix of vindication and renewed terror. She had been right all along. There had been someone in the walls, watching her, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The thought of how close she had come to becoming another victim haunted her. The final twist in the tale came when investigators, combing through old town records, made a startling discovery. The original builder of the duplex, a reclusive man named Elias Blackwood, had disappeared shortly after the house was completed in 1897. His body was never found. Among Blackwood's personal effects, preserved in the town's historical society, they found architectural plans for the duplex. These plans included the hidden passages and chambers, along with disturbing notes about creating the perfect observation post to study human behavior. The full extent of Blackwood's crimes would never be known, but it became clear that he had designed the house as a twisted experiment, a way to watch and study unsuspecting occupants. Somehow, over the decades, others had discovered his secret and continued his dark work. The site where the duplex once stood was eventually turned into a memorial park for the victims, but many in the town swore that on stormy nights, they could still hear footsteps and see a shadowy figure watching from where the house once stood. Olivia never returned to the town. She moved across the country, changed her name, and did everything she could to put the nightmare behind her. But no matter where she went or what she did, she could never shake the feeling of being watched. In every shadow, every reflective surface, she imagined she could see a pair of eyes staring back at her. The story of the Watcher in the Walls became a cautionary tale, a reminder that sometimes the greatest threats are the ones we invite into our homes without knowing. It served as a chilling testament to the vulnerability we all feel when alone in the dark, and the terror of realizing that the sanctuary of our home may not be as safe as we believe. For those who heard Olivia's story, home took on a different meaning. Every creak in the night, every unexplained shadow, became a potential threat. The idea that someone could be watching, waiting, hidden within the very walls of our homes, tapped into a primal fear that resonated with people across the country. Jake Thompson, a 28-year-old software developer, had always been a night owl. His job allowed him to work flexible hours, which often meant coding late into the night from the comfort of his small apartment in suburban Seattle. The quiet solitude of the night suited him perfectly, allowing his mind to focus entirely on the intricate puzzles of his work. On this particular night in late October, a fierce storm raged outside. Rain lashed against the windows, and wind howled through the trees, creating an eerie ambience that Jake barely noticed, engrossed as he was in his latest project. The clock on his computer showed 2:37 a.m. when he finally decided to take a break. Stretching his arms above his head, Jake got up to make some coffee. As he waited for the water to boil, a flash of lightning illuminated the backyard. For a split second, Jake thought he saw a figure standing among the trees at the edge of his property. He blinked, and in the darkness that followed, he could see nothing but the rain-soaked landscape. Shaking his head, Jake attributed the sighting to his tired eyes and overactive imagination. He poured his coffee and returned to his desk, determined to finish his work before calling it a night. As he sat down, the power flickered momentarily. Jake saved his progress, just in case the storm caused an outage. No sooner had he done this than the lights went out completely, plunging the apartment into darkness. Sighing in frustration, Jake used his phone's flashlight to navigate to the basement where the circuit breaker was located. The basement stairs creaked ominously as Jake descended. The beam of his flashlight created strange, shifting shadows on the walls. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, Jake froze. There, unmistakably, were wet footprints on the concrete floor, footprints that were too large to be his own. Jake's heart began to race. He swept the flashlight around the room, half expecting to see an intruder lurking in the shadows, but the basement appeared empty. He quickly located the circuit breaker and flipped the switches, restoring power to the house. As light flooded the basement, Jake noticed something that made his blood run cold. The small window near the ceiling was open, rainwater dripping onto the floor below. He was certain he had closed and locked it the last time he was down here. Panic rising in his throat, Jake rushed back upstairs, fumbling with his phone to call the police. As he reached the top of the stairs, he heard a sound that made him stop in his tracks, the soft creak of floorboards coming from the spare bedroom. Jake stood paralyzed with fear, his mind racing. Someone was in his house. He looked toward the front door, wondering if he could make it outside before the intruder reached him. But the storm outside seemed just as threatening as the unknown danger within. Gathering his courage, Jake decided to confront the situation. He grabbed a heavy trophy from a nearby shelf, a relic from his college coding competition days, and slowly made his way toward the spare room. The door was ajar, and as he approached, he could hear heavy breathing from within. With his heart pounding so loudly he was sure it would give him away, Jake pushed the door open. The room was dark, but a flash of lightning revealed a tall figure standing by the window. In that brief moment of illumination, Jake saw that the intruder was facing away from him, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. Before Jake could react, the figure turned. Another flash of lightning revealed a face that would haunt Jake's nightmares for years to come. Pale, gaunt, with eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. The intruder's mouth opened in a silent scream, revealing rows of sharp, pointed teeth. Jake stumbled backward, dropping his makeshift weapon in shock. The intruder lunged forward with inhuman speed. Jake turned and ran, his only thought to reach the front door and escape into the storm. He could hear rapid footsteps behind him, gaining ground with every second. Just as Jake reached the front door, a hand grabbed his shoulder, its grip impossibly strong. He was spun around, coming face to face with the nightmarish visage of the intruder. Up close, Jake could see that its skin had a greenish tint and appeared to be covered in fine scales. In a desperate move, Jake brought his knee up hard, striking the creature in the midsection. To his surprise, the grip on his shoulder loosened. He took advantage of the moment to wrench the door open and run out into the rain. The storm battered Jake as he ran down the street, his bare feet splashing through puddles. He didn't dare look back, terrified of what he might see. His lungs burned and his legs ached, but fear drove him onward. After what seemed like an eternity, Jake saw the welcoming glow of a 24-hour diner. He burst through the doors, startling the few patrons inside. Soaking wet and wild-eyed, he begged the confused staff to call the police. When the officers arrived, they found no trace of an intruder in Jake's house. The basement window was closed and locked, and there were no footprints or signs of forced entry. The spare room was undisturbed. The police suggested that Jake's late-night work sessions and the violent storm might have caused him to imagine the whole incident. But Jake knew what he had seen and felt. He couldn't shake the memory of those glowing eyes and sharp teeth, the inhuman strength of the creature's grip. He refused to return to his house, instead checking into a hotel for the next few days. In the following weeks, Jake's life changed dramatically. He couldn't bring himself to work late at night anymore, always making sure to be in bed before midnight. He installed a high-tech security system in his house and rarely spent time alone. Every unexplained sound, every shadow in the corner of his eye, brought back the terror of that night. Months passed, and slowly, Jake began to convince himself that perhaps he had imagined the whole thing. The stress of his job, combined with lack of sleep and the violent storm, could have caused some sort of hallucination. He started to relax, falling back into his old routines. Then, exactly 1 year after that fateful night, Jake received an envelope in the mail. Inside was a single photograph showing him asleep in his bed, taken from the doorway of his room. On the back, written in spittery script, were the words, "See you again soon." Jake's sense of security shattered once more. He realized with growing horror that the nightmare was far from over. Whatever had entered his house that stormy night was still out there, watching and waiting for the perfect moment to return. The incident changed Jake forever, leaving him with a constant sense of vulnerability. He learned the hard way that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones that invade the sanctity of our homes, turning our safe spaces into realms of unimaginable horror.